"You're fired," Alexander Laurent roared, his voice shattering the silence of the boardroom as he watched the clumsy girl tremble before him. But as he ruthlessly exiled the intern for her latest mistake, he had no idea that the secret legacy of his entire empire was hidden inside the tattered bag she was clutching to her chest. Alexander is the ice-cold, billionaire CEO of Laurent Tech, a man who values perfection above all else, while Evelyn is the accident-prone clumsy girl whose life is falling apart under the weight of a mysterious burden. The powerful CEO fires her without a second thought, blinded by his own arrogance, but as security drags her away, a single item spills from her worn-out bag that stops his heart, a relic from a past he thought was buried forever. Why was this clumsy girl carrying the keys to $1 billion secret legacy? What was she desperately trying to tell the CEO before he crushed her career? And why does her tattered bag hold the one truth that could destroy Alexander's world or save it? The 64th floor of Laurent Tech did not feel like an office. It felt like a cathedral of cold glass and silent judgment. Alexander Laurent stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the skyline of the city he essentially owned. In his hand, he orbited a small, hexagonal piece of silicon and gold, the Aegis chip to the world. It was the future of clean energy. To him, it was a tombstone. It was the last thing his father, Thomas, had been working on before his accident 10 years ago. Alexander's tailored charcoal suit cost more than most people earned in a year, and his watch, a rare heirloom, ticked with the precision of his own heart. He had spent a decade purging emotion from his life, replacing it with the steel-cold logic of a man who climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on fingers. To Alexander, every person was a tool. If the tool was blunt or broken, it was discarded. "Mr. Laurent." The voice was small, vibrating with a tremor that Alexander found irritating. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He knew it was Evelyn, the intern from the research wing, who had been assigned to transport the prototype for the final board presentation. "You're late by 90 seconds, Evelyn," Alexander said, his voice a low, melodic growl. In this building, 90 seconds is the difference between a market lead and a bankruptcy. "I'm sorry, sir." The elevator. There was a man. "I thought I was being followed," she stammered. Evelyn looked out of place in the sterile, white-on-white office. Her cardigan was peeled at the elbows, and she was clutching a canvas tote bag as if it contained her very soul. She was pale, her eyes darting toward the shadows of the hallway, where the CFO, Julian, stood watching with a thin, oily smile. Julian had always been the shadow in the Laurent family history, the loyal partner who had been the first to comfort Alexander's mother after Thomas disappeared, yet the first to sign the papers that restricted the boy's inheritance. Evelyn stepped forward to hand Alexander the cooling case for the chip. As she reached out, her foot caught on the edge of the designer rug. It was a clumsy, awkward stumble, the kind of mistake Alexander detested. "Watch out," he snapped, but it was too late. Evelyn plummeted forward. The prototype case flew from her hand, hitting the marble floor with a sickening crack. The Aegis chip, the result of a decade of secret labor, skittered across the floor and shattered into 1,000 useless glints of gold. Silence suffocated the room. In that silence, a memory flashed behind Alexander's eyes. His father, Thomas, holding a similar chip 10 years ago, his face lined with worrying. "Alex, the world isn't ready for what this can do. If anything happens to me, find Sarah. She has the heart of the project." The memory faded as Alexander looked at the ruin on the floor. I didn't mean to. I was pushed ... double quotes, Evelyn whispered, her face draining of all color. She scrambled to pick up the pieces, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip them. This wasn't just clumsiness. It was the physical manifestation of a woman who hadn't slept in 3 days, whose mother lay in a hospital bed with no insurance, and whose only hope was the hidden file she had found tucked inside an old, silver-bound journal in her attic. Alexander looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't just break a piece of hardware, Evelyn. You broke the only bridge I had left to my father." He stepped back, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. "Security is already on their way up. You're fired. I want you out of this building, out of this district, and out of my sight. Leave the bag. Leave everything. No. Please, my bag, I need it," Evelyn cried, reaching for the canvas tote that had fallen near his desk. As security grabbed her arms, the bag tipped. A rusted silver key, ancient and etched with strange Nordic runes, slid across the floor, stopping exactly at the toe of Alexander's Italian leather shoes. Alexander froze. His breath hitched. He had seen that key once before hanging around his father's neck the night he never came home. As security dragged Evelyn toward the elevator, her desperate pleas echoed through the hollow glass halls of the executive floor. But Alexander Laurent was no longer listening to her voice. His world had narrowed down to the small, rusted silver key resting against the toe of his shoe. To anyone else, it was a piece of scrap metal. To him, it was a ghost. He remembered his father, Thomas, sitting in the study on that final, storm-ravaged night 10 years ago, his hands trembling as he tucked that very key under his collar. "If the lights go out, Alex, the key is the only thing that will lead you back to the light," his father had whispered before disappearing into the dark. Alexander reached down, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the technology he sold. He looked up, but the elevator doors had already hissed shut, swallowing the clumsy girl who had just shattered his company's future and upended his past. Alexander strode toward the security desk, his presence commanding the air out of the room. "Where are they taking her?" he demanded, his voice a sharp blade. The guard stammered, "To the employee lockers, sir." Standard exit protocol. Alexander didn't wait for a response. He took the service stairs 3 at a time, his mind racing through the logic gap that was now Evelyn Harper. She was a nobody, a low-level intern from a background of struggle. Yet she carried the master key to his father's private vault, a vault Alexander hadn't been able to locate in a decade of searching. He reached the locker room, just as Evelyn was being forced to empty her locker. The space was a stark contrast to the luxury of the upper floor's grey, metallic, and smelling of industrial cleaner. Evelyn stood by her locker, her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling as she pulled out a worn-out stethoscope and a stack of overdue medical bills. Alexander watched from the doorway, observing the status of a woman he had just ruined. Beside her, a 16:9 cinematic shadow loomed. Julian, the CFO, had followed him down. Julian leaned against a locker, his expensive silk tie shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Tragic, really," Julian remarked, his voice smooth as oil. "She was always so frantic. I told you these charity hires were a mistake, Alexander. Her mother worked in the old labs, didn't she? Some disgraced researcher. Like mother, like daughter." Evelyn spun around, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce fire that defied her clumsy reputation. "My mother was not disgraced. She was protecting the project from people like you." She lunged for her canvas bag, which sat open on the bench, but Julian's hand shot out, pinning the bag down. "Careful, girl," Julian hissed, his mask of friendliness slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "You've already cost this company billions. Don't add a lawsuit to your problems." Alexander stepped into the light, his eyes locked on Evelyn's bag. "Let go of the bag, Julian." The CFO hesitated, then laughed, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. Alexander turned to Evelyn, his gaze piercing. "Your mother. Her name was Sarah, wasn't it?" Evelyn's breath hitched. A flashback flickered in the corner of her mind, a younger Sarah Harper, her lab coat stained with ink, frantically stuffing a leather-bound journal into a canvas bag, while a young Evelyn watched from under a desk. "Keep this safe, Evie. It's not just paper. It's the secret legacy of a man who wanted to change the world. If the billionaire's son ever asks, you show him the heart, not the machine." Evelyn clutched the bag to her chest, her knuckles white. "You fired me, Mr. Laurent. You told me to get out of your sight. My mother is dying in a ward because your company denied her pension. I have nothing left to say to you." She turned to bolt, but as she moved, The bag ripped along a pre-weekend seam of sabotage Julian had orchestrated minutes before she entered the boardroom. A thick, leather-bound journal with the Laurent family crest tumbled out, accompanied by a sealed file labeled The Harper Project, Final Phase. Alexander's heart stopped. The clumsy girl wasn't just an intern. She was the guardian of the one thing his father died to protect. The locker room felt like a tomb. Alexander stared at the leather-bound journal. The silence was broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. But the air was thick with the stench of a betrayal, 10 years in the making. Julian's face paled, the oily confidence draining from his features as he stared at the Laurent family crest embossed on the journal's cover. Alexander's mind flashed back to the day of his father's funeral. He had been a broken 20-year-old, and Julian had stood beside him, whispering that Thomas had died a failure with no assets left to his name. He lost everything in the gamble. Alex, Julian had lied, his hand on Alexander's shoulder. But I'll make sure you're taken care of. In the present, Alexander felt a cold, sharp clarity. He looked at Evelyn, who was on her knees, desperately trying to gather the papers from the file that had spilled out. He saw the way she positioned her body not out of clumsiness, but as a shield, protecting the documents from Julian's reach. "You knew," Alexander whispered, his voice vibrating with a dangerous resonance. "Julian, you knew my father left a final phase, and you've been hunting it for a decade." Julian let out a sharp, forced laugh, straightening his silk tie. "Alexander, don't be dramatic. That girl is a thief. She clearly stole those from the archives. Why else would a clumsy intern have the CEO's private family records in a tattered bag?" He stepped toward Evelyn, his voice dropping to a snarl. "Give me the journal, Evelyn. It's company property." "No," Evelyn cried, her voice cracking but firm. "It belongs to the caretaker. My mother spent 10 years hiding from your collectors, Julian. She told me how you tried to buy her silence, and when she wouldn't sell, you made sure her medical records were flagged so she could never work again." She looked up at Alexander, her eyes brimming with a mixture of hatred and hope. "I didn't trip in that boardroom. Mr. Laurent, your CFO tripped me. He saw me waiting outside your office with this bag, and he knew exactly what was inside. He wanted the chip to break, so you would fire me, and he could catch me alone in this hallway." The logic gap of her clumsiness vanished, replaced by the terrifying reality of a corporate assassination attempt. Alexander's gaze shifted to the hallway shadow. He remembered a detail he had overlooked: the way Julian had been the one to insist on Evelyn being the courier for the prototype today. It was a setup. Julian had engineered the accident to ensure Evelyn was disgraced and discarded, making her an easy target for theft. Alexander stepped between Julian and Evelyn, his massive frame casting a shadow over the CFO. "You're the one who's fired, Julian. Leave your badge on the bench. If I see you on Laurent property again, I won't call security, I'll call the federal investigators." Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure malice. "You think you've won? You don't even know what's in that file. Alex, you're holding a ticking time bomb. That secret legacy isn't just a battery, it's proof that your father was going to dismantle this entire company and give the patents away for free. You'll be a billionaire with $0 by morning." He turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. Alexander turned to Evelyn. He didn't offer his hand, he knew he hadn't earned that yet. Instead, he looked at the medical bills scattered on the floor. "The Harper Project," he said softly, reading the title on the file. "Why did my father trust your mother with this instead of me?" Evelyn stood up, clutching the torn bag. "Because he knew you were being raised by Julian. He knew you were being taught to value the machine over the heart. My mother was the only one who knew that the project wasn't a piece of tech, it was a person." She pulled a folded, yellowed photograph from the back of the journal. It showed Thomas Laurent laughing, holding a toddler in one arm, and a woman who looked exactly like a younger version of Evelyn in the other. The fluorescent lights of the city's public hospital hummed with a depressing, rhythmic buzz that set Alexander's nerves on edge. He had spent his life in private clinics, where the floors were polished to a mirror finish and the air smelled of expensive lila. but this place smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. He followed Evelyn down a cramped hallway, his presence as a billionaire CEO drawing stares from tired nurses and grieving families. He was a titan of industry and a world of peeling wallpaper. "She's in 4-0 to be," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the squeak of her worn sneakers. She was still clutching the torn canvas bag, her knuckles white against the strap dot. As they entered the room, Alexander stopped. The woman in the bed was a ghost of the vibrant researcher he had seen in the photograph. Sarah Harper was hooked to a symphony of beeping machines, her breathing shallow. On the bedside table sat a small, framed picture of the same Nordic silver key. Evelyn had dropped the key to the legacy. "Mom." Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, taking Sarah's hand. "I brought him. I brought Alexander." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, clouding with a mixture of fear and recognition. She looked at Alexander, then at the leather-bound journal he now held. A flashback gripped the room's silence. 10 years ago, Sarah was in the Laurent basement lab, her face streaked with soot. Thomas Laurent stood over her, handing her a folder. "If I don't make it back, Sarah, Alexander will be surrounded by sharks. They will try to turn him into one of them. Do not give him the project until he sees the cost of the machine. Only then will he be ready to lead." Alexander stepped closer, the weight of the journal feeling heavier than any gold bar. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I could have paid for all of this. I could have saved you, because you were your father's son. But Julian's student," Sarah rasped, her voice a dry rattle. "You were building walls of glass while the world was freezing." Thomas didn't want a CEO. He wanted a protector. The foreshadowing of the Harper project began to click into place. Alexander opened the journal to the middle page, where a hidden compartment revealed a DNA test result from 2 decades ago. His eyes widened as the logic of his father's hidden life was laid bare. Thomas hadn't just been Sarah's employer. He had been her partner, in every sense of the word. "The secret legacy ... double quotes," Alexander whispered, looking from the document to Evelyn. "It's not the energy chip, it's the bloodline." The logic gap of why a clumsy intern was so deeply tied to the company's inner sanctum was gone. Evelyn wasn't just a guardian of the files. She was the missing Laurent. The reason his father had vanished was to draw the sharks away from his secret family, leaving the machine to Alexander, and the heart to Evelyn. Suddenly, the hospital room door slammed open. 2 men in dark suits, Julian's collectors, stood in the doorway. "Mr. Laurent," one said, his hand reaching inside his jacket. "The CFO wants that bag, now." The sterile silence of the hospital room shattered as the lead collector stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the tattered bag Evelyn held. Alexander felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer the CEO behind a mahogany desk, but a man protecting the only family he had left. "You're in the wrong room," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. He stepped in front of Evelyn, his broad shoulders acting as a human shield. "Julian says the secret legacy belongs to the company." "Alexander," the man sneered, his hand tightening on the handle of a suppressed pistol. "And since you've been removed by the board in an emergency vote 10 minutes ago, you're just a trespasser." Alexander's mind flashed back to a weekend at his father's mountain retreat when he was 12. Thomas had taught him how to disable a security system using a simple bypass. "Sometimes, Alex, you have to break the machine to save the system." In a blur of motion, Alexander didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the heavy, leather-bound journal. He swung it with a precision that betrayed his refined status, slamming it into the first man's throat. "Run, Evelyn." The back stairs. Alexander barked. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag, her clumsiness replaced by a desperate, focused agility. As they sprinted down the narrow, dimly lit service corridor, the contrast in their status was gone. They were just the fugitives in a labyrinth of peeling paint and flickering lights. Alexander felt the weight of the silver key in his pocket, the key that Evelyn's mother had guarded with her life. "Why did they vote you out?" Evelyn gasped as they reached the parking garage, her breath hitching in the cold night air. Julian must have used the shattered prototype as proof of my instability. Alexander realized, his eyes scanning for his armored sedan. He needed me out of the building to seize the Harper files. They reached the car just as the collectors burst through the stairwell door. Alexander threw Evelyn into the passenger seat and floored the accelerator. As the city lights blurred into long, cinematic streaks of neon, the foreshadowing of his father's final words echoed. The legacy is with the one who carries the heart. He looked at the clumsy girl beside him, her face smudged with tears and hospital grime, and realized the secret legacy wasn't just a discovery, it was a revolution. "We can't go to my house," Alexander said, checking his rearview mirror. "They'll be waiting. We go to the old lab, the one my father told your mother about." Evelyn opened the bag and pulled out a small, handwritten map tucked inside the silver-bound journal. "The address isn't on the map, Alexander. It's encoded in the Nordic runes on the key." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a realization that bridged their separate lives. "My mother didn't just hide the files. She hid the location of the only working prototype." The armored sedan cut through the outskirts of the city, leaving the glowing towers of Laurent Tech behind for the jagged silhouettes of the industrial district. Inside the cabin, the only light came from the blue-tinted dashboard, casting deep shadows over Alexander's face. He felt like a man stripped of his armor. His title was gone, his board had turned, and his only ally was the clumsy girl he had insulted hours ago. "The key," Evelyn whispered, pulling the rusted silver relic from her bag. "Look at the bow. These aren't just decorations." Alexander glanced down as she held it near the dashlight. The Nordic runes weren't just etched, they were layered. He remembered his father's obsession with old-world puzzles, a hobby Alexander had dismissed as a waste of time. Flashback 15 years ago. A young Alexander watches his father hunched over a magnifying glass. "Patterns, Alex. The world is built on patterns. If you can't see the hidden language, you'll only ever see the surface." Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "The surface is a lie. Julian taught me to look at the numbers, but my father was looking at the coordinates." He grabbed his phone, but the screen was dead remotely wiped by the company. He was officially a ghost in his own empire. "We need a light source with a specific frequency," Evelyn said, her voice growing steadier. The clumsiness of her intern persona, fully discarded for the brilliance of a woman who had spent a decade studying her mother's hidden notes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, modified laser pointer, a tool she had used in the labs when she thought no one was watching. "My mother told me that the truth only reveals itself under a blue light." She clicked the pointer. The blue beam hit the silver key, and suddenly, the dashboard wasn't reflecting metal, it was projecting a map. The runes acted as a microscopic lens, casting a shimmering, holographic blueprint of an old lighthouse on the northern coast onto the windshield. "The lighthouse," Alexander breathed. "That was my father's first project. He said it was a failure and sold it to a shell company." "He didn't sell it," Evelyn corrected, her eyes fixed on the projection. "He hid it. The Harper project isn't just a chip, Alexander. It's a decentralized power grid. It would make energy free for everyone. That's why Julian wants it. He doesn't want to sell power. He wants to own the switch." The secret legacy was finally becoming clear. The logic gap of why Thomas Laurent, a man of immense wealth, would live a double life was anchored in a moral choice. The billionaire wanted to end poverty, while his partners wanted to monetize it. "If Julian gets to that lighthouse first, he'll wipe the servers," Alexander said, his voice hardening. "He doesn't want the tech to exist, he wants to bury it, so his current patents stay valuable." As they neared the coast, the road became narrow and treacherous. Alexander looked at Evelyn, noting the way she clutched the bag, not out of fear, but out of duty. "Why didn't you just run away with the files? You could have sold these to a competitor for millions. You wouldn't have to worry about your mother's bills ever again." Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time, the status gap between the CEO and the clumsy girl felt like a joke. "Because my mother didn't raise a thief, she raised a Laurent." The car crested a hill, and there it was, the lighthouse, standing like a silent sentinel against the crashing waves. But as the headlights swept across the grass, they illuminated 3 black SUVs already parked at the base. Julian was already there. The lighthouse stood like a jagged tooth against the bruising purple of the pre-dawn sky, but the salt air was thick with the scent of gasoline and impending violence. Alexander killed the headlights, rolling the sedan to a stop behind a thicket of gnarled pines. He looked at the 3 black SUVs Julian's collectors had beaten them to the gate. "They don't have the key," Evelyn whispered, her breath fogging the window. "They're trying to force the lock, but the system is keyed to the runes. They'll blow the door before they solve the puzzle." Alexander reached into the back seat and grabbed a heavy crowbar from the emergency kit. He looked at his hands that usually signed multi-million-dollar contracts, now gripped cold steel. Flashback 12 years ago. Thomas Laurent stands on this very cliff, pointing at the lighthouse. "Alex, a leader doesn't just sit on a throne. He guards the gate. If you aren't willing to get your hands dirty for what's right, you don't deserve the name." He hadn't understood it then. He had thought his father was being eccentric. Now, as he watched Julian's men haul a crate of industrial explosives toward the lighthouse base, the foreshadowing of his father's failure became a lighthouse of truth. "Stay behind me," Alexander commanded. "If the shooting starts, you run for the cliffs. Don't let them take that bag." "I'm not leaving you," Evelyn countered, her voice sharp and steady. She reached into her bag and pulled out the shattered pieces of the Aegis chip he had fired her for breaking. "You thought I was clumsy, but I was scavenging. Look." She held the pieces together. They weren't just broken glass. They were magnetic components designed to sync with the lighthouse's main transmitter. The chip was never the power source, Alexander. It was the detonator for the global grid. Without these pieces, Julian has nothing but a pile of scrap metal. They move through the tall grass, ghosts in the dark. Alexander used his status as a former CEO to his advantage. Knowing the security protocols Julian's men would be using, protocols he himself had approved. They slipped past the first perimeter guard, Alexander using the crowbar to strike with a silent, ruthless efficiency that would have shocked his board of directors. As they reached the heavy iron door of the lighthouse, they heard Julian's voice booming from a megaphone. "Blow it. We don't need the girl alive anymore. We just need the drive inside." "Wait." Alexander stepped into the light of the SUV's high beams, his arms raised, the silver key gleaming between his fingers. "You want the secret legacy, Julian? Here it is. But you touch her, and I'll drop this into the ocean." Julian stepped forward, his tailored coat flapping in the wind, a predator who thought he had cornered his prey. "You always were a sentimental fool, Alex, just like your father. Give me the key, and I might let you keep enough stock to retire in a flyover state." The logic gap of Julian's plan was his own greed. He didn't realize that the key wasn't the final step. Evelyn was. As the collectors moved in to seize Alexander, Evelyn slipped toward the control panel, hidden in the rock face, her small, clumsy hands moving with the speed of a master engineer. The iron door groaned under the weight of the explosives. But before the lead collector could trigger the blast, the heavy mechanism hummed with a deep, subterranean power. Evelyn had slotted the shattered pieces of the Aegis chip into the external interface, and the secret legacy finally began to wake up. The lighthouse wasn't just a building, it was a massive conductor. "The key, Alex, throw it," Evelyn shouted over the roar of the wind. Alexander didn't toss it to Julian. He pivoted and hurled the silver relic toward Evelyn. She caught it midair, a feat of coordination that proved her clumsiness had been nothing more than a mask for a woman living in constant survival mode. She jammed the key into the central slot of the rock-face control panel. The ground vibrated. A beam of pure, white light shot upward from the lighthouse lantern, piercing the dark clouds like a spear. "Stop her!" Julian screamed, his composure finally shattering. As the collectors lunged, Alexander stepped into their path. He wasn't fighting for a company or a stock price. He was fighting for the sister he had almost lost before he even knew she existed. Flashback 10 years ago. Thomas Laurent's last letter, hidden in the journal, read, "Alexander, If you are reading this at the lighthouse, it means you have finally looked past the glass and seen the person standing next to you. The Harper Project is only dangerous in the hands of those who want to rule, in the hands of those who want to serve. It is salvation. Alexander took a heavy blow to the ribs, but he didn't falter. He grabbed the lead collector, using the man's own momentum to hurl him against the SUV. Behind him, the lighthouse door hissed open. "It's not just a blueprint, Alexander," Evelyn called out from inside the threshold. Her bag was open on the floor, the final files scattered around her like a halo of truth. "It's the server. Every patent Julian tried to bury is being uploaded to a public domain right now. In 60 seconds, the Laurent monopoly is over. Energy will be free." Julian scrambled toward the door, his face a mask of desperation. "You're destroying billions. You're making yourself a pauper, Alex. Think about your status, your life." Alexander looked at Julian, then at Evelyn, who stood framed by the light of a new world. "I've spent 10 years being a billionaire, and I've never felt poorer," Alexander said, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "I think it's time I tried something else." The logic gap of the Harper Project was finally filled. It wasn't a weapon to be owned, it was a gift to be given. As the upload bar hit 100%, a pulse of energy rippled out from the lighthouse, short-circuiting the electronics of the SUVs and Julian's phone. The machine of the old world had just been broken by the heart of the new one. The collectors, seeing their paychecks vanish into the public domain, lowered their weapons. Julian fell to his knees, staring at the lighthouse as it signaled the end of his reign. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of bruised gold and soft pink. The violent storm of the night had retreated, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Alexander stood on the edge of the cliff, his charcoal suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with oil and blood, and his heirlooms forgotten. He watched the last of the black SUVs retreat down the coast road. Julian huddled in the back seat not as a titan of industry, but as a man whose currency had just become obsolete. Inside the lighthouse, the hum of the servers had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. Evelyn stepped out onto the gallery, still clutching the tattered bag that had been the catalyst for the night's revolution. She looked exhausted, her face pale under the morning light, but the tremor in her hands was finally gone. "The upload is complete," she said, her voice carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. "Every lab, every university, every small village with a receiver, they all have the blueprints now. The Laurent monopoly didn't just break, Alexander. It evaporated." Alexander turned to look at her. The clumsy girl who had tripped in his boardroom was now the architect of a new era. The status reversal was absolute. He was a man with a frozen bank account and a disgraced name, while she was the guardian of the future. Flashback 5 years ago. Alexander had stood in his penthouse, looking at his reflection in a gold-rimmed mirror. "Power is held, never shared," he had told himself, repeating Julian's favorite mantra. In the present, he realized that power held too tightly eventually crushes the one holding it. "What happens to Sarah?" Alexander asked, his thoughts returning to the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep this secret legacy alive. "The grid is already powering the hospital's new wing," Evelyn said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "I got a message from the head nurse. The machines didn't flicker when the city grid went down. She's stable, Alexander. She's going to make it." The logic of the Harper Project was now anchored in its first real-world victory. It wasn't about the billions lost. It was about the single life saved. Alexander felt a strange, light sensation in his chest, a lack of weight he hadn't felt since his father disappeared. He looked at the bag at Evelyn's feet. It was empty now. The files gone. The journal's secrets out in the open. "I have no company left to give you," Alexander said, his voice quiet. "The board will be in ruins by noon. The stock is worthless. I never wanted your company, Alexander," Evelyn replied, stepping closer until she stood beside him on the precipice. "I wanted my brother back. My mother told me that Thomas always believed you'd find your way to the lighthouse. He just didn't know if you'd come to burn it down or turn on the light. foreshadowing from the Nordic keys runes finally clicked. The symbols didn't just mean legacy. They meant home. Alexander looked out at the city in the distance, where lights were beginning to flicker on, powered by a source that no one could ever build again. The world didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet, shimmering glow that began at the coast and rippled across the skyline. As the sun fully crested the horizon, the city below began to pulse with a steady, blue light, a visual confirmation that the secret legacy was no longer a secret. Alexander and Evelyn stood together on the lighthouse gallery, the wind whipping at their clothes. To survivors of a war that had been fought in shadows for a decade, Alexander looked at the bag. Evelyn held the same tattered canvas sack he had mocked in his boardroom. It was frayed at the edges and stained with the night's struggle, but to him, it now looked more valuable than any vault in Laurent tech. Flashback, final memory. He remembered his father, Thomas, sitting him down as a teenager, pointing at a map of the world's poorest regions. The greatest wealth, Alex, is the wealth that cannot be hoarded. If you ever find yourself in the dark, look for the person who has nothing but their heart. They are the ones carrying the light. He had spent his life looking at the clumsy girl and seeing a failure. But he realized now that her clumsiness was the weight of the world she was carrying for him. What now? Evelyn asked, her eyes fixed on the horizon. You're not a CEO anymore, Alexander. You're a man with a target on his back and a sister who's technically a digital outlaw. Alexander reached out, and for the first time, he didn't offer a cold handshake. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of status-free solidarity. Now, we protect the heart. Julian and the board will try to sue, but you can't sue the sun for shining. We've given the world the blueprints. Our job is to make sure no one builds a fence around them again. The logic of their future was clear. They were no longer defined by the billions they owned or the titles they held. The CEO had found his soul, and the clumsy girl had found her throne. They left the lighthouse as the first groups of people, engineers, students, and curious neighbors began to gather at the gates, drawn by the light dot as they walked toward the car. Alexander picked up the silver key that had fallen into the grass. He didn't put it in his pocket. He handed it back to Evelyn. This belongs to the caretaker, he said with a respectful nod. The story that began with a CEO fires a clumsy girl ended with a family reborn. The bag was no longer heavy with secrets, but light with possibility. As they drove toward the hospital to see Sarah, the rearview mirror showed the lighthouse standing tall, a monument to a father's love and a daughter's courage. The secret legacy was finally home.